Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever. Today I'm bringing you guys a brand new track review segment where I can talk about some recently released songs that I happen to check out and have some opinions on. So yeah, with all that said, let's get right into these reviews. They are just my own personal opinions, so if you disagree, that's perfectly fine. The first track I'm going to be talking about here today is this new Deafheaven track, Black Brick. This track comes out after a few months since their last release, Ordinary Corrupt Human Love, that came out back last year. One of my favorite albums of last year. I thought it was a pretty great project and still one that I come back to rather frequently. So I was pretty excited to hear this new track that the band dropped. I'm not sure if this is going to be tied to any full-length project or if this is just a loose cut they decided to drop for one reason or another. Doesn't really matter though. Overall, this track is kind of interesting as it sees the band not really implementing a lot of the more dreamy, shoegazy elements of their band really, and just focusing a lot more on the black metal style that they have always incorporated to some extent in their previous music. Only on this track, like I said, they're really focusing on it a lot. That's not to say that some of Deafheaven's distinct personality doesn't shine through on parts on this track. However, this is a lot more straightforward black metal than what you might expect coming off of their last album. So if you're someone who hasn't really been into these guys because they mix genres the way that they do, maybe you'll like this track a bit more. However, for me personally at least, I think this is an okay track really, but not a great one. It's definitely nowhere near as good as any of the tracks from their last album in my opinion. And you know, it kind of makes sense considering stylistically it doesn't really fit with the rest of the tracks on that album. But yeah, I'm a fan personally of the different sounds that the band is able to pull together and mix in a really interesting format. I'm one of those people who likes that overall. So to see the band kind of, remove that to some extent here on this track is a little disappointing. There are elements to this track that I do enjoy. I like the very aggressive delivery here on this track. There are some riffs that pop up here and there in the song that I think are pretty decent overall. However, I don't know, this track just didn't pop out to me in the same way that a lot of songs from the band's last album did. Probably because it's a bit more one-dimensional when it comes to the sound of this thing. And like I said, there might be a certain group of people out there who are going to like this track more as a result of that. But for me personally, I think it's an okay track. Not one that I mind listening to again, but probably not a song I'm going to come back to frequently in the future. Overall, I'd recommend that only fans of the band or black metal fans who really weren't a fan of some of the band's more experimental genre mixing releases should check this out. Yeah, just an okay track for me. Next up, we're going to be talking about this new Xiu Xiu track, Yellow Candle. This track is kind of interesting as well, considering that the band just dropped a full-length project, in February, and they have this other just single floating around, released around the same time. And if you saw my review for the new record from these guys, I really like the album. It's one of my favorite albums of the year so far. I like the really dark, kind of scary at times atmosphere it had going for it. And this track is a little bit different overall. It's not as dark or overwhelmingly, anxious or anything quite like that. It's a bit more, not exactly calm. I wouldn't quite say it's that, but, comparatively to that album, it feels a bit more, stripped back in some senses of the word. If anything, this track does remind me a little bit of some of the more low-key moments from the band's last album, like the closing track, Real Love, for example. I like the kind of whispered delivery of the lyrics here on this track. It creates a kind of ominous atmosphere. Like I said, it's not oppressively dark like a lot of the material from the band's last album, but it still does create a sense of unease when listening to this thing, even if the instrumental here is, like I said, a lot more low-key, a bit more stripped back, and a bit more, calming at times even as well. It's definitely a bit of an interesting change of pace from that last album. I think it helps this track stand out to some extent from a lot of the songs on that previous project. Unlike the Deafheaven track I was just talking about, which kind of became a bit one-dimensional compared to some of the tracks that preceded it on the band's last full-length album. This track, while it's different sounding from the band's last, album, it's not more one-dimensional or anything. It's just a bit different of a sound, and I think it's one that's pretty nice overall. Not one of my favorite tracks, or it wouldn't have been one of my favorite tracks had it been included on that last album from this group. but it's still a decent song overall. So if you're a fan of Xiu Xiu, give this one a listen. Alright, moving on, we're going to be talking about this new track from the Maine, My Best Habit. This is the second single that they've dropped from their new upcoming album, You Are Okay, that's set to release later this month. An album that, based on the last single from this project, I was pretty excited to hear, given that I really liked Numb Without You. I thought it was a really, kept the dark feel of Lovely Little Lonely, but unlike that album, which I thought was pretty boring overall, it was, catchy. There was really interesting instrumentation going on in the track. It was just a really solid cut overall. In fact, I might even like the track more now than I did when I initially reviewed it. It stuck with me quite a bit. Though I have a feeling I will be talking about that track again in full when I talk about the album proper. But this new track that they've dropped, I had a feeling this was the track that was going to really decide for me if I was going to be really excited for this upcoming album. And fortunately, I could happily say that I am pretty excited to hear what this album has in store after hearing this new track, because I think this new track here is pretty great as well. I don't like it quite as much as Numb Without You, but I still think it's better than anything that was on their last album. Once again, the band keeps a more mature atmosphere to this track, kind of like their last album. However, they're able to pull in a lot of those, big, catchy moments that made American Candy such a great album, in my opinion. The hook on this track is fantastic. It's massive. It's kind of bombastic too, in the best way. I really love the hook on this thing. It's easily my favorite part of the track overall. I will say that, instrumentally, this track isn't quite as experimental or adventurous as Numb Without You, which is a little disappointing, but overall, it's still a solid instrumental to the track. Overall, this is a pretty great pop rock song, and I'm really excited to hear this new album from these guys later this month, if these are the two lead singles that they've given us. Moving on, though, we're going to be talking about this new version of 30 Seconds to Mars's Love is Madness. This track originally appeared on the band's last studio album, America, that came out last year. An album that I really did not like at all. I thought it was really boring and lifeless and uninteresting. This track in particular from the album, the original version of the track, that is, was a track that really embodied a lot of those things I didn't like about the record. So I wasn't super excited to hear this new version of the track, but I decided, why not? What do I really have to lose? And the big distinction between the original version of the song and this one is that this version, as opposed to having a Halsey feature on the track, has a feature from Emma on it. I mean, I don't know who Emma is personally, never heard of her before or any of her music. This is my first exposure to her. And what she brings to this track is not all too different from what Halsey did in the original. The only thing that's really super distinct is that she's singing in like another language here on this track. Not sure exactly which language it is. It sounds kind of like Portuguese or Spanish. I'm not 100% sure. Maybe I am wrong in those two guesses. If you are, if you do know with 100% certainty, feel free to leave it in the comment section down below. But honestly, it really doesn't make much of a difference to me when it comes to enjoying this track, as it really doesn't change up all that much that's going on here in this song. Having this feature that's in a different language just kind of changes the track up slightly enough to make it different, makes it maybe the slightest bit more interesting, but only in the most surface level way possible, because obviously adding a different language into the track is going to make it a bit more interesting, but still, this track is still incredibly boring and lifeless and uninteresting. The delivery here on this track from both Emma and 30 Seconds to Mars is really, like I said, lifeless. I'm running out of words to describe it, honestly, because there's nothing else I can really say other than the fact that it's just really boring. I mean, if you've heard America and the songs from the album in general, you know what you're going to get into when you're listening to this. So if you like that album, and I mean, no hate to you if you do like that album, we all have our own personal opinions, then I think you will like this track to some extent. But if you did not like America like I did, you're not going to like this track pretty much. It's that simple, really. Alright, the last track I'm going to be talking about here in today's video is actually not a new single that's been released, but rather a bonus track for a recently released album. In particular, the track Viper King off of Dream Theater's newest album, Distance Over Time, the bonus track version of that album to be specific. Considering I've started this new track review series here on the channel, I figure instead of just reviewing singles and things like that, I'll also cover bonus tracks, deluxe edition tracks, things like that from recently released albums here in this segment as well, considering I don't talk about them in my album reviews. I have reviewed this album, the standard edition of the album, on the channel already, and I will try to put a link to that in the description down below if you want to see my thoughts on the full album. But yeah, we're going to talk about this bonus track from it here now. Overall, I think that this track is decent, like much of Distance Over Time, really. Honestly, this track has a bit more of a poppy edge to it, I guess you could say, when it comes to the overall structure of the track and things like that. Not saying it's an outright pop song or anything like that, because, I mean, it is Dream Theater, so it's obviously not, but it kind of reminds me of a track like Paralyzed from the album in the sense that it has a more conventional structure to it and things of that sort. Though I will say that this track is definitely better than Paralyzed. It has a bit more interesting ideas in it overall. It's a bit more exciting than Paralyzed was. I feel like the vocal performance on this track is also a bit better. The kind of hollow, metallic sound that a lot of the vocals on that album had to them, Paralyzed in particular, isn't as bad here on this track. What I'm trying to get at here is, with my frequent comparisons to Paralyzed, I kind of wish that this track had taken Paralyzed's place on the album, because both kind of fill a similar role, only I feel like this track does it a bit better. I mean, I don't think that this track is like, out of this world, fantastic or anything like that. It wouldn't have been one of my favorites on the album had it been included proper. And at the end of the day, it's just kind of a decent song in my opinion, like, the album as a whole is to me. But I will say, for this more straightforward approach to a Dream Theater song, it works better than Paralyzed does. I will give it that. So yeah, I would recommend this track mostly to Dream Theater fans. I feel like if you're not a fan of this band, you're not going to like this track really all that much. And if you like that new album from them, Distance Over Time, I have a feeling you'll like this track to some extent, given that it feels very much in line with a lot of the tracks on that album, given that it is a bonus track. But if you didn't like that album, or you don't like Dream Theater for whatever reason, I wouldn't bother checking this track out. But yeah, it's just my own personal opinion. And with all that said, that concludes today's track review segment. So yeah, that's all I had to say about this week's new tracks. If you happen to agree, disagree with me, whatever it may be, feel free to leave your own thoughts in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, make sure you leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content, things like album reviews, more track reviews. If you like that kind of stuff, make sure you subscribe. Thank you for watching once again, and stay golden.